It's time now for our first presentation of the day, and I'm delighted to say that we are joined by Greenpeace. Founded 50 years ago, the environmental organisation barely needs an introduction, but their strapline says it all. Together, we defend the natural world and stand for a green and peaceful future. Our two speakers work in Greenpeace's legal team. Kasey Valente is legal coordinator of Greenpeace International, and amongst other things, she coordinates their international legal internship programme, which sounds absolutely fascinating. And Litigation, Counsel and member of the New York Bar, Louise Fournier, is our other speaker. She oversees the organisation's climate justice and liability strategies. For the next 20 minutes or so, they're going to treat us to an overview on the societal changes that Greenpeace has already achieved through their work and campaigning, and on the changes that must still come. Kasey and Louise will be staying on for that panel discussion after their presentation for your questions, so please send them in as soon as they occur to you, and we will get through as many as we possibly can. Kasey, Louise, thank you so much to both of you for joining us from Amsterdam, and I shall hand over to you. Thank you.
Nikki, thank you so much for that warm introduction. Lou and I are very happy to be here with you today. Good day to all of you listening today. We were happy to hear that in addition to focusing on renewables, this year's Scottish Highland Renewable Energy Conference will also focus on climate change. Greenpeace has an unwavering commitment to sustainability and the protection of biodiversity in all its forms, and to develop solutions for a green, just, and peaceful future. So I agree with Nikki and David. These are some themes that we are going to be hearing throughout the day. We're eager to discuss some of the solutions that we see with you today. So thank you very much, Harper McLeod, for inviting us. We are in an incredibly challenging moment in history, with multiple crises unfolding that pose very tangible threats to human survival. In such times, we must step up our collective responsibility to support those who are most at risk. More often than not, it's the poorest and the least responsible around the world, least responsible for the damage, right? We must also understand that in recovering from crises, we also have the occasion to design and develop solutions that are sustainable and can promote a safer, greener, more peaceful, and just future for all. The time for the development of those solutions and for action is now. Now is the time to transform the world around us, a time to look beyond symptoms and address root causes together. The decisions we make now will shape our world for generations. We can either invest in a resilient recovery from the pandemic that also tackles climate change and builds a more just and equitable society, or we can continue on a path towards climate disaster and economic crisis.
This transformation needs to happen to result in emissions reductions that enable the world to meet the Paris Agreement goal of limiting the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we know that this will not happen without a rapid expansion of the renewable energy industry. However, a net zero carbon future must put people at the center of the recovery. For renewable energy companies, that means also respecting human rights of workers and communities. The transformation has to come from shrinking of oppressive power and creating the space to exercise people power. One of my favorite authors and community leaders, Grace Lee Boggs, used to say that people are aware that they cannot continue in the same old way, but are immobilized because they cannot imagine an alternative. We need a vision that recognizes that we are at one of the great turning points in human history. We're so happy to be here with you today to talk about this vision of climate justice and why corporations have a high stake in leading the transition. We want to share with you 3 reasons why businesses should take the lead in combating climate change and how that can lead to societal shifts, drawing from the experiences of the Greenpeace network in climate litigation.
In 2009, we started looking at strategic litigation to assert the fundamental rights of those most impacted by the climate crisis, to address the multiple social, political, and environmental layers of the problem in a cohesive way. Legal strategies would help us address the source of the threats and not only their outcomes. In thinking this through, we identified 3 premises of Greenpeace's climate justice and liability campaign. First, people have rights. Every single one of us has the right to a healthy environment and a safe climate, but also the right to work in dignity. Second, states have duties. Governments have legal obligations to act in a manner that protects people from the impacts of climate change. Governments do not have unlimited discretion. They must take ambitious actions to address the climate emergency and other crises like COVID-19, protect human rights in the process, preserve institutions for the people, and ensure that private actors do not infringe on human rights. Third, businesses have responsibilities. For example, fossil fuel companies and their financial backers have legal responsibilities to prevent, mitigate, and remedy the climate-related impacts that are linked to their products. They have a responsibility to urgently transform their business models and leave no one, especially their workers, behind. Renewable energy companies have responsibilities to ensure that they do not cause human rights harms throughout their operations. If climate change and COVID-19 have taught us anything, it's that all the social and systematic injustices that persist in our societies are exacerbated in times of crisis. What is important is realizing that we have to tackle these crises collectively, and at the same time to address inherent inequalities in our system that lead to people experiencing the brunt of climate change or not being able to recover from disasters as quickly. Building an intersectional approach means understanding the climate crisis and other environmental battles in relation to other social struggles against racism, sexism, neoliberalism, and neocolonialism, and away from Eurocentrism.
So having set out the basic principles of our campaign and of our work, I think it's safe to say that everyone in this virtual Zoom room, whether we're policymakers, activists, lawyers, business leaders, or young people, are agreeing that the climate crisis is affecting people's human rights right now. But why should businesses take an active role in combating climate change? And why should businesses actually see climate change as an intersectional human rights issue? Firstly, we say because climate change is a business risk. In 2015, Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, delivered a now famous speech to Lloyd's of London, the world's leading insurance bank. He described 3 broad channels through which climate change can actually impact financial stability. The first one is because of impact risk, which are the physical risk due to the impacts of climate change, such as floods or storms that damage property and disrupts trade. And we have seen this recently in Texas with the snowstorms. Secondly, he described the transition risks. These are financial risks that could result from the transition to a lower carbon economy. Finally, he mentioned the liability risks. Corporations and investors are increasingly exposed to liability for their contribution to climate change and for the human rights impacts of their products. 6 years later, in 2021, the mega risks identified by Mr. Carney are well upon us. Which brings me to our second reason why businesses must act on climate change. If they don't, they risk being sued. Over the past decade, climate litigation has really boomed across the world, with now over 600 cases of strategic climate lawsuits brought by individuals and communities. With the research showing that actually 90 corporations are responsible for almost 2/3 of all human-made CO2 emissions, it's no surprise that climate litigation increased in the recent years. Communities are holding these fossil fuel companies accountable for not only failing to disclose the risk of their products, but also for actively denying climate change and misleading the public and policymakers all these years. For instance, dozens of municipalities in the US, including the New York City and San Francisco, have launched lawsuits to hold fossil fuel companies financially responsible to recover the cost of adapting their cities to climate change impacts. Also in the US, the Attorney General of Washington, D.C. and Minnesota filed lawsuits against big fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, and Chevron. They're claiming that these companies have spent millions upon millions of dollars to deceive customers about the effects of fossil fuel extraction, production, and consumption, and about the effect that these is having on the climate crisis. They're arguing that these companies are thus violating consumer protection laws of those states. Such cases would only multiply as the evidence is increasingly stronger that the impacts of climate change felt more deeply and widely. Fossil fuel companies are also noticing and disclosing the very real risk of climate liability to their shareholders. But this liability risk is not only for fossil fuel companies. Some litigation is also directed at states for their failure to act on climate. And some of these cases that have been brought against states are actually to increase the mainstreaming of renewable energy capacity. A good example of that is in the case in Mexico. In 2020, Greenpeace Mexico's legal team successfully challenged the COVID-19 contingency policies of the energy sector. The policies were hampering the production of energy from renewable resources, while at the same time they were promoting conventional energy production based on fossil fuels. Greenpeace Mexico convinced the court that the country's fossil fuel-reliant energy sector is impairing the constitutional rights of Mexicans to a healthy environment, to health, and to life. In several regions in Mexico, citizens are experiencing respiratory problems due to the air pollution of the operation of coal-fired power plants, and struggling also to adapt to the impacts of climate change. The court agreed that the policies that limit the operation and participation of renewable energy companies in a national energy market was contrary to the government's international and national obligations, and suspended these policies permanently. Greenpeace Mexico's victory against anti-renewable energy measures shows the liability risk for one sector can become an opportunity for another. In this case, the opportunity to use litigation to uphold human rights to an affordable and accessible clean energy.
And thirdly, because businesses must participate in the social dialogue and lead the transition to be able to not only change our energy system in the face of climate change, but also our economic and political systems. For that, we need to ensure that the affected workers, trade unions, and communities are able to guide policies. In calling for a smooth transition for workers, last year, Greenpeace UK worked closely with Friends of the Earth Scotland and Platform, and they published a report titled Offshore, Oil and Gas Workers' Views on Industry Conditions and Energy Transition. In calling, the report builds on the survey of 1,383 offshore workers. This is about 4.5% of the workforce. The survey revealed the impact of COVID-19 on their lives, their views on life in the industry in general, and their hopes and solutions for the energy transition. In addition to the survey results, there were 8 case studies from the workers themselves, revealing an exhaustion with the precarious nature of the work in oil and gas, and a huge appetite for alternative industries, including offshore wind and other renewables. Key results included 81% of the offshore oil and gas workers would consider leaving the industry. 43% had been made redundant or furloughed since March of 2020. 91% of the respondents had not heard of the term just transition. Given the option of retraining to work elsewhere in the energy sector, more than half would be interested in renewables and offshore wind. To reiterate, one of the fundamental premises for Greenpeace's climate justice and liability campaign, I'll repeat, people have rights. Every single one of us has the right to a healthy environment and a safe climate, but that also means the right to work, a free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Given the findings of the survey, Platform, Friends of the Earth Scotland, and Greenpeace UK made recommendations fitting within 3 areas for action, which we urge you to consider during the rest of the conference. The first are skills and experiences of oil and gas workers are essential to deliver an equitable and rapid transition to renewable energy. This requires engaging a representative section of the workforce in policymaking, where workers are able to help determine policy in addition to engagement with trade unions. The rhetoric of a just transition means nothing if impacted workers are not at the heart of shaping policies that affect their livelihoods and communities. It's the only means to ensure no harm to communities currently dependent on high carbon industries. Second, improve job security and working conditions for workers in the oil and gas sector to boost morale, improve quality of life, and mitigate the risk of workers leaving the energy sector altogether. And the third one was to address barriers to entry and conditions within the renewables industry, including creating sufficient job opportunities, to harness the skills of the oil and gas workers and enable an equitable and rapid energy transition. We have the opportunity of using green energy to not just get to net zero, but actually moving away from the injustices connected to the fossil fuel industry. From air pollution, land seizures that affect low-income communities and indigenous peoples the most, and also corruption. For that, we need you, the renewable energy sector in Scotland, to take the lead in putting human rights at the center of your business practice. Enter into continuous conversations with communities and indigenous peoples, and generally show that a green and just economy is not just about decoupling economic growth from fossil fuels, but a vision of an alternative and better future.
This year, amidst an acute public health crisis and a chronic climate emergency, we have a historic responsibility and an opportunity to accelerate a just transition. We're so glad to see all of you, experts and industry leaders of the Scottish renewable energy sector, embark on this together. Coal, oil, and gas companies have been significantly weakened during the pandemic, and people are supporting bold, ambitious, and systemic solutions. There's a growing constellation of legal decisions that are helping to make the case that new investments in fossil fuels are unlawful. Shifting power from fossil fuel corporations to renewable energy is essential. But leaving no one behind is not enough. We need to ensure that ordinary people are not just not left behind, but are actually in the front, driving the transition. And that starts at home with the oil and gas workers. In November this year, government leaders will gather in Glasgow for COP26. It is being billed as a landmark test for global climate diplomacy. It will mark 6 years since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. The deadline is looming for governments to prove their solidarity and deliver concrete, ambitious plans for a pathway to 1.5 degrees. It presents an opportunity for the renewable energy industry to lead the conversation on climate justice, just transition, and intersectionality. There is a vibrant climate justice movement. This movement is toxifying fossil fuels, building community power, increasing people's sense of agency, and contributing to the biggest mindset shift of the century. We invite you to join this movement and be part of a new system that defends and promotes public and planetary health. Thank you so much for having us, and back to you, Nikki.
My goodness, Lou, Kasey, thank you so much for that. So much food for thought, and so much actually in what you said that was mirrored by Rosanna Cunningham's speech. You both talked so much about just transition, about responsibilities. Kasey, I was really struck by your 3 points. People have rights, states have duties, businesses have responsibilities. There is just so much in that. God, where do we start with this, David? I'm going to hand over to you to ask the first question. Otherwise, I know I'm going to completely dominate the next 20 minutes. And do you want to kick in with something there?
Well, maybe rather than ask a question, maybe just pick up a bit on just transition, Nikki, because it was mentioned it really applies in two different contexts. And one context, which Kasey covered, is what we call the energy transition, the transition from fossil fuels into renewables, and making sure that oil and gas workers are not left redundant and we can use those transferable skills. And Scotland obviously has a large oil and gas industry, so it's important that we do that. The Minister didn't elaborate, but the Minister was using just transition, I think, also in the second sense that the impact of COVID has not really been felt equally across society. Marginalised groups have been hit the hardest. And as we move into green recovery, the government would really like to reset our progress towards a net zero economy in a way that tackles that inequality and promotes regional cohesion. If I give some examples of that, when people have had to work from home during COVID, they've obviously had to have their heating on. If you're poorer people in society, that's an increased expense. So the government is looking to tackle warmer heating in Scotland. You can't work very well from home if you don't have a good broadband connection. So the government's trying to ensure that broadband is routed out across the country. And for people who can't afford electric cars, then it's important that our public transport fleet is replaced so that there are electronic buses, so on, coming on. So I think there was quite a lot of parallels between what Rosanna was saying and what Kasey and Louise were talking about. But I'd be interested to get their views also on that. And one other question which occurred to me for Kasey and Louise is, what actions do Greenpeace take that have the biggest impact? Where have you seen the greatest success?
Should I start, Kasey?
That would be great.
With the first part. Thanks so much, David and Nikki. It was really interesting to hear the cabinet minister's speech and how much it echoed with our presentation right now. And when we're talking about just transition, we need to look at precisely what you're saying, David, the intersectionality of it, and how the struggle for climate crisis is the same struggle for the public health emergency and is affecting people who are in vulnerable situations more than others. And I think what was really telling was one of the results from the survey. We keep talking about just transition a lot, but 91% of the workers themselves had never heard of this term. So when we're talking about just transition and leaving no one behind, how can we ensure that actually these workers and communities are really shaping the policies? And from that point of view, we think that this is where the just transition and where Scotland could have a worldwide leadership position.
And a huge opportunity there for people who have been made redundant in oil and gas to help upskill the renewables, because one of the things Rosanna Cunningham talked about was the massive opportunity that there will be for the renewables industry going forward. And of course, what the renewable industry will need are staff who know how to actually do the jobs that need to be doing to get that renewable energy out to us. Some questions from our delegates, so our audience, if I may jump in with those. I think maybe Karen Bolam, who's an environmental leader, David touched on this earlier and we perhaps didn't get to it. What action that Greenpeace has taken has had the biggest impact? And perhaps we're looking back over your 50 years in history, and that's a big question there. But Kasey, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I'll give it a try. So definitely that's a huge question. What action has Greenpeace taken that's been most successful? So I don't know that I can pin it to just one, but I will say, thinking about the history of Greenpeace, very much the action started with bearing witness. So witnessing things that were happening and bringing them forward to more people and to the public, and to create an awareness of what was happening in our world. I think that there's still a lot of that today. Lou and I, of course, focus on legal work, strategic litigation, and how we can move our Greenpeace campaigns forward through using the law, using different tools. But there are lots of different ways that Greenpeace protects the environment and brings things to the public or to the consciousness to create those societal shifts that we need to see, where we maybe are complacent in thinking something is okay. And then we create an awareness and we show actually this is really hurting our world and hurting the planet. So I think Greenpeace has a really storied history of being successful at that.
Of course, I mean, bearing witness and then shining a torch on what is happening. We can't, as a society, whether that's a Highland and Island society, a UK society, a European society, or a global society, we can't do anything about the things that we don't know about. So bearing witness, so incredibly important. Karen Bolan also had a question. How do we ensure collaboration between companies, especially when intellectual property has an influence? And I know I'm talking to three lawyers there. I don't know who wants to jump in and take that one. None of you. That's perhaps one that we'll...
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, how do we ensure collaboration between companies, especially when intellectual property has an influence? That might be one that needs some greater thought, and we can scoop that up in the questions for post-conference.
Yeah, I would just fully admit I am not a lawyer. So, which is funny that I'll be the one to jump in and say this, but I would just say communication would be the starting point of a successful collaboration between different organizations or different companies, and just setting out projects and guidelines and things like that early on.
So I guess the sort of things that Greenpeace have been doing all along, bearing witness, shining a torch on what's happening, and then communicating so that everyone can better understand the entirety of the situation and move forward, I guess, in knowledge of what's going on. We've got a question here from Dermot from Extinction Rebellion in Scotland. And I wonder if this is one that you might want to pick up on, David. What is the government doing to ensure COP26 results in concrete action towards keeping global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees this century above pre-industrial levels? Dermot, obviously we don't have the minister available. She was not available to join us. David, do you feel qualified to answer that on behalf of the government?
Well, I'll give it a go. If we're talking about the Scottish Government, Nikki, I think it's all about demonstrating what we have actually done. The key thing here is that we move at COP26 from words into concrete actions. Scotland was chosen to host, it's a UK conference, but Scotland was chosen as the venue for it because it was seen as the UK country which had developed most in relation to renewable energy and tackle climate change. So it's really important that if the UK and Scotland are saying to the other delegates, this is what we need to do, that they can demonstrate they've done so themselves. So, for instance, Scotland has an excellent track record of closing down our coal power stations. There's been press coverage recently over the proposed new coal power station in England, which wouldn't help the case very much. So it's that type of thing. I think the UK government is coming from quite a long way behind here, certainly a long way behind the Scottish government. It's put out its 10-point plan in its recent energy statement. It needs to back all of these things up, but we've done a great deal in closing down fossil fuel. We've done a tremendous amount in renewable energy in Scotland in relation to onshore wind and hydro, in England in relation to offshore wind, where we're now a world leader. So it's important that these things are backed up. And we say to people, this is the path we've got to go. And hopefully with the recent change of presidency in America, that will give it a boost. And Joe Biden and John Kerry will really want to push on and show how America can get back on track. So it's really about everyone, walking the walk, talking the talk, putting, what they say into action and taking things forward.
Kasey, I can see you nodding there. Anything that you'd like to add?
No, I just agree about walk the talk, right? It's time. I just feel like it's time for action. And so I was, yes, definitely nodding along as David was mentioning that. I really, Lou and I mentioned, just no more talk, time to show us, right? So that's well.
I was very conscious when you were talking that you used the phrase "the time is now," which was the refrain in the song that we opened this conference for. There isn't time to spend time, although of course that is what we were doing today, spending time talking and chatting and discussing. But if Greenpeace hadn't done that, started doing that 50 years ago, shining the light, asking for action, saying this is what is happening, we need to change. It's perhaps a shame that we weren't able to hear what you were saying 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and acting on more of that at the time. Perhaps we wouldn't be where we are today if we had paid a little bit more attention. Time is marching on. Thank you so much to our Greenpeace guests, Kasey, Valente and Lou Fournier. Really, really great to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us from Amsterdam. We appreciate you giving up your time and sharing your insights and your vision. Thank you so much. David, you are up next, I believe. Chairing a fireside chat on the key asks for developers and investors. Topics on the table for your next session include: what are the hurdles from a developer's point of view? How can communities become involved? And what is the investment perspective?